What is your darkest family secret? Story 1. My brother injured himself in the leg on purpose to avoid serving in Iraq and tried to claim it was from an enemy attack. I learned about this the day I arrived in Afghanistan for my year-long tour. All I heard at first was that he had been shot. Later I found out it was a self-inflicted wound, and he was placed under suicide watch before being dismissed with a less than honorable discharge. He has never actually told anyone this. I only heard it through the National Guard, which often felt like a gossipy small town. I do not hold it against him. War was terrible. Sadly, he has ruined his life since then by turning to alcohol and withdrawing from the world. Just sad all around. Also, my mother and her sister married the same man, so all my siblings are also cousins with each other. Story 2. My biological father was born in Japan. He is half Japanese, and according to a genetic test, half Irish or something close to it. My grandmother Toyoko adopted him and brought him with her to the United States when she moved here with her husband. My grandmother was very quiet about her experiences living in Japan during the Second World War and afterwards in United States-occupied Japan. Only after she passed away did I hear stories she had shared with others about hiding in cellars and bank vaults during air raids and facing mistreatment from soldiers. Possibly due to what she went through at that time, she was unable to have children of her own, which led her to adopt my father. Everyone I spoke to had a different version of how she had adopted her son. As a child, I had been told she adopted him legally from an orphanage. Later, I was told he might have been her sister's child. Another version was that she had been informed someone had a baby to give up, and she was told to be at a certain building at a certain time. When she knocked, a door opened, a baby was placed in her arms, and the door shut again. Over time, I realized she told a different story to everyone who asked. No one knows for sure where my father actually came from, who his real parents were, or what the circumstances of his adoption truly were. Story 3. My great-aunt had strong feelings for a man, but the problem was that he was already married. That detail did not stop her. One day when the man went off to work early in the morning, she broke into the house and ended the wife's life in a violent way. Then she cleaned up, buried the body in the backyard, tidied the house, cooked dinner, and waited for him to come home. When he arrived, he noticed something was different. Out came my great-aunt to greet him. This was the first time the man had ever met her. Strangely, he saw it as a grand gesture of love. They ended up calling the police, and he even covered for her by saying he was responsible. He was arrested, spent a couple of years in prison, and then managed to bribe his way out. He returned to his old home with my great-aunt, and they lived together in what was considered a happy marriage for over 40 years until he passed away from natural causes. Story 4. My grandmother once tried to harm my grandfather. My father told me that my grandfather was controlling and emotionally abusive, never letting her go out, not even to church. My dad does not reveal much about the past, but I know there was a lot of resentment. Towards the end of his life, my grandfather suffered a stroke and was completely bedridden, unable to speak, though still coherent and able to understand. We had a full-time carer for him who handled his bathing and feeding because my grandmother did not want to. As it turned out, she was withholding food from both him and the carer. Later, we discovered she was also refusing to give him his medicines and would ignore him for hours when he had seizures. She would not provide him with adult diapers, leaving him in terrible conditions for days. Eventually, my uncle took him in and cared for him, even though my aunt was recovering from breast cancer. He improved somewhat under their care. My grandmother sometimes visited him and asked to be left alone with him. Once, the carer caught her trying to strangle him, and when confronted, she threatened to call the police. My uncle stepped in and forced her to leave. This worsened my grandfather's condition, and he ended up in intensive care for a while. At some point during a visit, my grandmother even managed to break his arm, though we did not realize it at the time because he could not speak. Story 5. My great-grandmother worked as a maid for a wealthy family. When the man she worked for passed away, she took my grandmother to the funeral and told her to take a good look, because that man was her father. There had been a scandal at the time, since he bought her a house while she was pregnant, but never claimed her as his own. When he died, she inherited nothing. Her half-brother went on to become a United States senator, but she never met him. My great-grandmother quickly married another man, and his name was the one that appeared on my grandmother's birth certificate. I always wondered why my mother kept us away from her grandfather's side of the family, and especially since they were all over the town where I grew up. It turned out she knew we were not actually related to them. A couple of years ago, one of my cousin's daughters, my cousin once removed, married someone with the same last name as our secret great-grandfather. She kept having to reassure people it was not the same family. On that same side of the family, I have an uncle who is in prison for abusing a child. My mother and her sister insisted he did not do it, even though he had harmed my cousin when she was little. She only revealed it after he was already in prison, but they still could not accept it. My aunt has since passed away, and my mother is now in a nursing home. For decades, since 1989, they had been depositing money into his prison account. When my aunt was on her deathbed, he even called asking if someone could put money in his account since his sister was no longer able to. I told my dad that we should give any money set aside for him to my cousin, the one he hurt, and let her decide what to do with it. He thought it was a great idea, and so did the other cousins. I am now trying to make that happen because he does not deserve anything. Story 6. My great-great-grandmother, who was single, came over from Germany after the First World War and had a child 2 months later. She met a man and worked for him for about a decade, during which time she mysteriously had 2 more children. Eventually, she got married, moved away, and left those children with the man. Later, she had my great-grandfather, who grew up never knowing about his half-siblings. That changed about 70 years later, when one of their daughters sent a letter to my grandmother explaining their connection. They quickly arranged a meeting and discovered they had been living only about 20 miles apart the whole time. From then on, they kept in touch. They even attended my grandfather's funeral in 1999, where it came out that some family members had known about the half-siblings all along. Whenever people asked how they were related, the older relatives refused to elaborate and brushed off the questions. My father, however, would always tell the full story to anyone who asked, making sure those older family members could hear every word. Story 7. My elder sister, who is 10 years older than me, had a different father from my mother's first marriage. My parents, in their so-called wisdom, decided they would only tell her the truth on her wedding day. As if that day wasn't already overwhelming enough, they chose that moment to reveal that my dad wasn't her biological father and wouldn't walk her down the aisle. The truth is, he had been raising her since she was 4 years old. She was his kid in every way that mattered. Instead, they let her grow up for decades wondering why I was the only grandchild who received Christmas or birthday gifts from our dad's parents, while she cried herself to sleep believing our grandparents didn't love her. Eventually, she found out after a friend, while drunk, shouted at her, "At least I know who my father is." She confronted our parents, and they coldly confirmed the truth. I still cannot understand how people can be so cruel. I cut off contact with my parents years ago for many reasons, but that was one of the biggest. Despite everything, my sister is doing well now. She got married a few years ago in a small Las Vegas ceremony, and our parents were not invited. I cannot lie, it gives me real satisfaction that they are still bitterly offended about that to this day. Story 8. This isn't exactly a dark secret, but it is one of the most disturbing parts of my life. My dad has a girlfriend who is still married to her husband, and she had a child with my dad who is not legally his but is biologically his. As a kid, she behaved in ways that were inappropriate toward me, but the worst was when I was around 19 or 20. She told me that when my dad passed away, she wanted me to take her in, make her mine, and take care of her. She also told me that my dad didn't love me or my sister Vanna as much as he loved her, and that he considered us after her. I once tried to tell my dad about some troubling behavior, but he didn't take it seriously. It wasn't surprising. He often made unsettling comments and rarely showed real concern. Nobody in my family truly knows the full story except my mom, and to some extent, my dad. As strange as it sounds, this is actually one of the less difficult things I've faced. Now that my dad has had health problems, the only way I can check on my younger sister is through his partner. I hate seeing my sister because it means being around her, and it makes me feel like a terrible brother. It breaks me to know my sister is being raised by her and that I cannot do anything to improve her life without destroying my own. They have almost no money, I have no money, and his girlfriend refuses to work because of her mental health struggles. They are likely facing serious financial trouble, and if my dad dies, I fear I might not even legally have a sister, since they are too broke to go to court to fix the documents. even though blood tests have proven she is his child. Story 9. I do not know if this counts as the darkest, but I will share it anyway. When I was 16, I am now 23, I found out that my uncle was essentially the kingpin of my city. He was involved in selling illegal substances, weapons, gangs, and everything else that came with that life. My mother told me just last year that there was a time he needed to hide a stash at her house because one of his associates had informed on him. The police never found anything, and my mother was paid well for helping him. Looking back, it made sense why I was always treated with so much respect, and why elders in the community would speak to me first, even though where I live in the South, it is customary for younger people to greet first. I also realized why no one ever messed with us, while others around us often did not have the same protection. Apparently, before he was caught, he knew it was coming after the betrayal. He hid money in different places around the city. One spot I knew of was my aunt's backyard, and he also put money under my grandmother's name, so when he asked for it, it was technically his. Up until last year when he was released, and during the previous 24 years, he was using money he had hidden himself. When I finally met him, I was surprised. I expected someone harsh and intimidating, but he turned out to be a goofball, and I love him. Now he lives with my grandmother, who has dementia, and he supports his daughter financially. Story 10. My great-great-uncle, whom I never met for reasons that will become clear, had an affair with a poor black woman in the 1950s. The affair resulted in the birth of a daughter. My uncle abandoned her because of her race and went on living comfortably with his white family. His daughter grew up in poverty, surrounded by racism. Back then, some stores even had signs saying no blacks, and she was too afraid to reach out to her biological family for fear of rejection. As a teenager, she even tried to bleach her face. Eventually, my great-great-aunt, his sister, a small woman, no taller than 4'5" but fierce, found out about everything. She completely cut ties with her brother for being a racist who had abandoned his child. She welcomed her niece with open arms, and so did the rest of the family. Even the uncle's own children refused to speak to him again. My aunt stepped up as the head of the family, and from what I know, my uncle died alone and destitute. This story was often told at family gatherings whenever newcomers seemed confused about why half the family looked extremely white and blonde, while the other half was black. My aunt would usually add, "And if you have a problem with that, you can go join my brother." Story 11. My grandfather is Polish-German and came from a very wealthy family that belonged to the lower nobility, owning large amounts of land. There are even photos of him as a child sitting at a grand piano in an elegant room, with his mother dressed in furs behind him. Then the Second World War came, and being Polish, they suffered terribly. All their wealth was stolen by Germans, and their town was bombed by Allied forces. His entire family was forced into a ditch, where a soldier threw explosives. His aunt shielded him with her body, and he survived, but half his foot was blown off, and he was left holding only his mother's hand. Her body was gone. He was just 5 years old, the only survivor. He was later adopted by his German uncle, who sold all the land and took the remaining money that legally belonged to my grandfather. That same uncle tried to kill him, but my grandfather ran away and lived homeless. Eventually, he became a truck driver, and at 17, he married my grandmother, who was 16. Later, we found out his uncle had been involved in illegal business during and after the war, producing and selling drugs, and that he was a Nazi who eventually fled the country. Nobody knows where he or the stolen family fortune ended up. His children and grandchildren once tried to reconnect with my grandfather, but he refused. To this day, his story has remained the same for the last 18 Christmases, Easters, and birthdays. My grandfather is a remarkably tough man. He once fought off a robber with his cane and refused to call the police, saying they were useless. At the retirement home where he lives now, several women have written him love letters and invited him on dates, and he still proudly says he is a communist who fought Nazis after the war. Story 12. My grandmother passed away in 2009. She was the rock of our family, kind, compassionate, and the one who held everyone together. I was adopted by her son, and I first met her when I was about 4 years old. She welcomed both my mom and me with open arms. In 2016, my dad passed away unexpectedly, which strained family ties further. My aunts and uncle tried to claim my parents' house, arguing over whether my parents had paid off a second mortgage loan that my grandmother had once signed in her name. My mom found the paperwork that proved the loan was resolved, but the stress caused a rift. I avoided family gatherings for months. About 9 months after my dad's passing, my mom got a call with shocking news. My dad was not actually the oldest sibling. When my grandmother was a teenager, she had a baby girl and gave her up for adoption, something she never told anyone. Records confirmed I had another aunt who never got to meet her biological mother or brother. It all made sense then why my grandmother always treated me so warmly, never judging me for being adopted myself, even back in the early 1980s when there was still stigma around men marrying women who already had children. Family relationships remain somewhat strained, but I have met my new aunt, and I've shared many stories with her so she could know more about the mother and brother she never got to meet. Story 13. I do not know much family history on either side of my parents, but here is what I do know. My dad was manipulative and needed control over everything in the household. He discouraged relationships and even kept people, including family, from visiting our house. Because of that, I eventually pushed back by running away and moving 3 states away. That only made things worse for my mom, as he turned up the mental abuse against her. At one point, he threatened her with a gun to her head, saying he could end her life and no one would ever know, that he could bury her in the backyard and she would never be found. It was not the first time he made such threats. Once, he even included me and my sister in his words. I only learned about this because I overheard my mom telling someone, and for the first time I understood what it felt like to truly fear for my life. And the reason behind it? Cleaning the house. It was never clean enough for him. Story 14. My mom told me to keep it secret from my dad. She revealed to me recently that one of her sisters once tried to sacrifice me as a child. In Banyuwangi, Indonesia, where she is from, black magic practices are common. She said her shaman brother cast a curse on that sister in revenge, claiming it left her with metal utensils and kitchenware in her belly. The story also included wild details about shape-shifting and Satan. When my boyfriend and I heard it in her broken English, we found it unbelievable and almost funny, but she insisted it was true. I asked how exactly her sister had tried to sacrifice me, and she said it was by strangling me, but that my impure blood, since I am half Indonesian, saved me. I never told my dad, but once over dinner I asked him if he remembered anything about my uncle. I said my only memory was riding on the back of his motorbike as he rushed me to the doctor in the middle of the night. My dad explained that it was one of the few times I had been seriously ill as a child, with a throat infection that required hospitalization. My boyfriend and I just looked at each other in silence, realizing that this lined up with my mom's strange story. Story 15. After I married my now ex-husband, our families revealed that we were distant cousins, not by blood, but still unsettling. His great-grandfather was my step-great-great-grandfather. But it did not stop there. My ex's grandmother had 2 children outside of marriage, each with different fathers. One day, while cleaning out an attic, we found letters from one man to the grandfather, saying he was the grandmother's boyfriend and the father of her youngest child, my ex's mother. He wanted to be in her life. We also found his obituary. He had been found shot and no one was ever arrested. Strangely, my ex's uncle had also been killed, again with no arrest. My ex himself was also born outside of marriage, and he grew up not knowing he was attending school alongside his 5 half-sisters. That was only the beginning. The step part came in because the grandfather, who had long since passed, had 4 children. My ex's grandmother was one, and my step-great-grandfather was another. I always knew him simply as Granddaddy. After my divorce, I learned the truth. He had been distanced from the family for reasons no one openly discussed. Later, he married my great-grandmother, who already had a daughter, my grandmother. For a time, she was left to be raised by an aunt, and when they returned to take her back, life for her became very difficult. In her teens, she quickly married my grandfather and soon after started a family of her own. My mom endured a difficult childhood, spending long periods away from her family with little support. When she finally came home, she entered an environment where she was not treated with care. Years later, my aunt went through similar struggles, and eventually her own children were also left in situations that repeated the same mistakes. In my life, history threatened to follow the same path within my marriage until I chose to end it. I made the decision that this cycle stops with me, and I will not allow it to continue any further. Story 16. I have a cousin who was adopted, but he does not know it. It might not sound like much, but it is more complicated than it seems. My aunt struggled for years to have children, but could not get pregnant. While in Mexico, she came across a young expectant mother who admitted she was not ready for a baby and did not know what to do. My aunt saw an opportunity to finally have a child and made a deal with the woman. She would take the baby after birth in exchange for money. The woman agreed. Months later, my cousin was born, and my aunt raised him as her own. This story has always been a secret in our family, especially since my cousin was more bought than adopted. It is sad knowing that his biological mother gave him away in exchange for money, and he still has no idea. Story 17. I am an Ashkenazi Jew, and over 25 years ago, I was working on a family roots project. Part of it involved interviewing my surviving grandmothers and older uncles about their memories from the Second World War. Most of the stories were what you would expect. Life in concentration camps, the destruction of family members in Majdanek, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. Nothing unusual for someone from my background. That was until I interviewed my paternal grandmother. Unlike many survivors, she carried herself with a light sense of humor, strong arms, and a sharp glint in her eyes that stayed with her until dementia finally set in around age 85. One evening, I sat beside her with my notebook and asked her about her time in the camp, specifically why she had been selected to work in a factory instead of being sent to a death camp. She began to tell me about how each day the Germans would deliver a single loaf of bread to her barracks, which held about 100 people. She described the cries of children, the pleas of the starving, and the sickly begging for just a morsel. Then she suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "And every time I would get that loaf, I kept it all for me and my siblings. Others cried, begged, even tried to steal from us at night. But I never allowed it, because that is what you do. You always fight to protect your own. Remember that." Afterwards, she went back to calmly chopping vegetables for the salad she was preparing, as if she had not just revealed something life-altering. At 14 or 15, I was shaken. Later, I realized that this was how she survived, by keeping her strength and working hard in the factory day after day. But hearing it firsthand changed the way I understood survival stories. Growing up in an Ashkenazi family, we were always taught about the horrors, the starvation, the deaths, and the inhumanity. Survivors were remembered as victims, and rightly so, but rarely did anyone speak about what choices they made to survive. That night made me realize that not all survivors were only passive victims. Some became incredibly ruthless just to keep going. I do not say this as criticism, but as a revelation that has stayed with me to this day. When my father came home that evening and asked how the interview went, I was too shaken to repeat what she had said. To this day, I have never told him, and the only people I have ever shared it with are my older brother and my wife. It remains etched in my memory as one of the most haunting truths I have ever learned about survival. Story 18. I had a cousin who died mysteriously in his late 20s. The autopsy came back as inconclusive, which always struck me as strange. He was not a troublemaker. Everyone loved him because he was kind and good-natured. My mother and I both thought it odd, not just because of the unusual autopsy report, but also because of the reaction of his mother. If it were me, I know my own mom would have spent the rest of her life demanding answers. But his mother seemed so accepting, almost detached, saying things like, "It is in God's hands now," and moving on. It never sat right with me. Years later, I dated a girl who claimed she could see spirits, like the boy in the movie, The Sixth Sense. She said it ran in her family, and she even avoided graveyards because spirits would follow her home. She told me about placing salt around her house to keep them out, and about how she would sometimes wake up to see them staring at her, often showing signs of how they died. She believed they lingered because they needed closure. I did not know what to make of it, but I kept an open mind. One day, while we were in my apartment, she said she saw a spirit walk past the door in the hallway. She described him, what he wore, how he carried himself, and immediately I knew she was describing my cousin. When I told her about him, she said he was trying to reach me through her to explain what happened. A few days later, she had a dream about him. She mentioned documents, medical records, she thought, that had been altered and had something to do with his death. My heart raced because my grandmother had been head of medical records at a hospital for many years. She suggested we visit her grandmother, Nana, whose abilities were stronger. People in her neighborhood even sought her out for readings. We went, and Nana described seeing my cousin's final moments. She saw him drinking from a green bottle, something he normally drank, then complaining of stomach pain, being driven to the hospital, and eventually frothy white liquid coming from his mouth before he died. That unnerved me because he had indeed passed away in his parents' car on the way to the hospital. His favorite drink was Mountain Dew, which in his small town was sold by the bottle at the local gas station. We also knew he had been complaining of stomach pain for months, and even his dog had died of poisoning during that time. Nana added that a small number of his immediate family knew the truth and had conspired to cover it up. The person who performed the autopsy was a family friend, and my grandmother herself was implicated as part of the cover-up. Her brother was his father. I later spoke with another cousin who had been close to him. I asked if she knew of any enemies or anyone who would want him gone, but she had no idea. I told her about my grandmother's possible involvement, though I had no proof. It was not like I could go to the police with dreams and visions from a girlfriend and her 70-year-old grandmother. So I let it go. That Christmas, I received a card in the mail from my grandmother. This was unusual since she normally handed them out in person at her house. Inside was a folded piece of paper with one message in large capital letters. Be very careful what you say to others. It terrified me. Looking back, I should have kept that card and shown my parents so we could confront her. But my first instinct was to destroy it and never speak of my cousin again. My grandmother passed away in 2011. I told my mom the story only a few years ago, but without evidence, it remains just that, a story. Almost 30 years have passed, and his death is still an unsolved mystery that haunts me to this day. Story 19. I have never been explicitly told the full story, but over the years I have pieced things together. My grandfather was in the Air Force and during that time married my grandmother from Thailand and brought her back with him. They had 4 children together. At some point, however, my grandmother met a man I will call Jay. She spent a lot of time with him while still married to my grandfather, and her last child, the only boy, was given Jay's name. I believe she had an affair by choice, because when I was a kid, she often babysat me, and I personally met Jay and visited his house. Up until about 10 years ago, they were still connected in some way. I have heard that she now denies cheating and instead claims that Jay assaulted her and forced her into things. But none of her children believe that, as she has never seemed completely stable. To give an idea of her mindset, she once accused my stepfather of stealing her underwear after he remodeled her house. Before that, she insisted her son's girlfriend had been stealing her clothes. These days, she spends a lot of time writing letters to Donald Trump, insisting that her children call him to wish him happy holidays and to tell him how much she loves him. She also seems to believe that people on the radio and television are speaking directly to her. Story 20. My own story is the one that has been hidden from almost everyone. I was born weak and asthmatic. My mom had an accident when she was 3 months pregnant with me, which caused her water sac to puncture, a rare complication. Because of this, my birth was treated like a major event, not only because of the risks, but also because my parents desperately wanted a girl. Due to my health problems, I struggled to speak. My voice would come out hoarse and strained, which made people think I was always angry. As a result, I was bullied from the time I was 3. Even as I grew stronger and my asthma improved, the bullying escalated. By 8 years old, I was depressed, and by 9, I began harming myself, cutting and jumping from heights. At 12 years old, I attempted to take my life with an overdose, but the doctors caught it and rushed me into intensive care. My parents told everyone it was food poisoning and did everything possible to erase the truth from medical records. They still believe that was my first attempt, but the reality is that I had already tried at least 6 times before. I failed only because the heights were not high enough, or the cuts not deep enough. That remains my darkest secret, something only my parents know, and not even my brother. But despite still battling depression and thoughts of giving up, I hold on. I have a dream to become a musician and choreographer, to heal people through my art. That dream keeps me alive, and I just hope the road ahead is one I can keep walking. Story 21. My parents grew up just 5 miles apart in a small town, but never met until their high school graduation day. They quickly fell in love and married 6 months later at 18. Right before the wedding, my mom became pregnant. Because it was small-town America in 1980, they decided to terminate the pregnancy to avoid scandal. Years later, they had my older sister, but were told afterward that scarring from the earlier procedure meant they would not be able to have more children. They adjusted and built their life, eventually buying and running a 24-hour convenience store. The plan was for my dad to work his 9-to-5 job while my mom managed the store. That worked until the surprise came. My mom was 7 months pregnant with me before she even realized it. My arrival turned their world upside down. Life became chaotic. A newborn, a demanding business, a father with a full-time job, and a mother trying to hold everything together. On top of that, I was born with severe asthma. My mom tried to get me diagnosed, but the doctor dismissed her. She and my dad took turns sleeping beside my bed because I would often stop breathing at night. At least once a week during my first year, they had to rush me to the emergency room. Meanwhile, my parents' marriage began to fall apart. My mom discovered my dad was having an affair with a stay-at-home mom whose children had already left home. When my mom caught them, the woman broke down, claiming she had nothing left in her life and wanted to end it all. In that moment, my mom made a desperate decision. She told the woman she could become my caregiver if she agreed to leave my dad alone. And so, my dad's mistress raised me for most of my childhood. This arrangement created a lasting divide between my mom and me. My parents eventually befriended my dad's former mistress and her husband, and we even spent holidays and vacations together. To me, she became like a second mother. But when I was 15, my mom left my dad. She decided it was time to reveal the truth, that the woman who had raised me was also the one who had destroyed her marriage. From then on, my relationship with my mom was strained beyond repair, and I cut off the woman who had cared for me. There has never been a real conclusion to this story. Everyone involved is still alive, and it remains an open secret in the family, only occasionally brought up when my mom has had too much to drink. Story 22. My great-grandpa had a wife and family before he married my widowed great-grandma. Back in the mid-1960s, he and his first wife lived on a couple of acres, and she loved to ride her horse through the meadow at night. One evening, after a huge argument, she decided to go for a midnight ride. Later, my grandpa claimed he found her after she had fallen from the horse, hit her head on a rock, and died instantly. Although never confirmed, many in the family quietly suspected that he killed her in a fit of rage. The story never made sense. There were hardly any rocks in that field, and she knew the land so well that she always avoided rough patches, even at night. On top of that, her head wounds seemed inconsistent with a fall from a horse. Her autopsy used words like supposedly and apparently, which suggested even the coroner doubted the story. My grandma refused to talk about the incident. My great-aunt barely mentioned her mother, and my great-grandpa carried the truth with him to his grave in 1998. It is one of those family secrets that only gets whispered about when you are old enough to be told. Story 23. My nan was one of 4 sisters and had one brother. When she drinks heavily, she sometimes shares fragments of the past. She revealed that troubling things happened within the family when they were younger, yet she still insists she had a wonderful childhood and speaks of her father as a great man. The contrast between what she hints at and how she remembers him has always unsettled me. Later, she married and moved away. After her father died, her mother adopted a baby girl. One of Nan's sisters had a little boy, and another had a girl, whom I will call Flo. The abuse, however, did not stop. Her brother went on to harm others in the family. Her nephew grew up deeply affected, struggling socially even into his 50s, though he remains kind-hearted. Flo eventually married my uncle, making them cousins by blood. Her brother's crimes did not end there. He went to prison twice for child pornography and likely did worse. Yet when he died, the family spoke about him with sadness, as though forgetting what he had done. Adding to the family's secrets, my granddad, Nan's husband, was said to have killed a man in a fight. He punched him during an argument, and the man died the next day of a brain bleed. With no witnesses, nothing came of it, but it is another shadow over the family history. Story 24. My grandmother had a baby boy before she met my grandfather. She gave him up for adoption and kept it secret her entire life, never telling my grandfather, who was an abusive alcoholic. She feared that if he knew, it would put her in danger. Still, she stayed in contact with her biological son, keeping journals of their letters and meetings. When she fell ill, she trusted only my father with the secret. He inherited the journals when she passed away. He kept them hidden until one day I stumbled across a crawl space in the closet with a photo album, her notes, the baby's birth book, and even an obituary for the boy's father. When I asked about it, my dad became furious, and later my mom quietly explained the truth. My mom also told me about a day when my dad came face to face with his half-brother. Around the time my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer, the man was so desperate to find her that he went door to door through the neighborhood asking for her by name. When he reached my parents' house, my dad knew exactly who he was, but told him he didn't know anyone by that name. Years later, after both my grandparents had died, I asked my cousins if they had ever heard about Grandma's first child. Not one of them knew. They were stunned. To this day, nobody knows where the man is, except maybe my dad, and he has no intention of ever saying. It remains one of the most tightly guarded secrets in our family. Story 25. I have no proof, but I am convinced that my great-grandfather, or possibly my step-great-grandmother, murdered my biological great-grandmother. Step-great-grandma was their maid, and while my bio-great-grandma grew sick over time and eventually died, just 3 months later my great-grandfather married the maid. The story was so well covered up that my dad and uncle grew up thinking the maid was their biological grandmother. Any evidence of my real great-grandmother was erased. One day my uncle happened to discover their wedding certificate and realized the maid could not have been their biological grandmother. Since then, both he and my dad have suspected foul play. The maid-turned-grandmother acted like a holier-than-thou woman, but she treated my grandmother and her brother terribly, while the 2 daughters she had with my great-grandfather were her perfect children. I have 2 disabled brothers, one older and one my twin. When my older brother was born and it became clear something was wrong, she scolded my mom, saying, "You and your husband must have sinned out of wedlock to be punished with such an abomination." She was cruel in every way toward my dad and uncle, but her own daughters and their children always described her as a saint. We were even forced to celebrate what would have been her 100th birthday. When my twin and I were born, she declared we were a gift from God for being good with our older brother. My twin had his first major brain surgery at 6 weeks old. A couple of weeks later, my mom was out shopping with us in a twin stroller, my brother's head wrapped in thick bandages. We ran into the woman and her church friends, and she started gushing over us while making cutting remarks about our older brother. My mom calmly picked up my twin, bandages and all, and said, "Here's your gift from God. He has the same disabilities as his older brother." That shut her up. My parents are Christians too, but they have never seen my brothers as punishments or abominations. From the very start, they did right by all of us. As for my bio-great-grandmother, I strongly suspect she was poisoned with arsenic. At the time, arsenic murders were common and undetectable until at least a decade later. Sadly, we cannot exhume her body because we do not even know where she was buried. My dad spent years just trying to track down her full name. Her family cut ties with her husband after he married the maid so quickly, and we suspect they either believed it was murder or, at the very least, that there was an affair going on beforehand. If only we knew where she was buried, we might finally uncover the truth. Story 26. My mother took her own life 5 years ago. To everyone outside of my immediate family, it seemed to come completely out of the blue. But within the family, we knew the truth. She had long struggled with mental illness and spent years in and out of psychiatric hospitals. As a child, I never understood why she was always upset, but I remember once overhearing her on the phone with one of her doctors, threatening to end her life. From that moment on, I lived in constant fear of coming home from school and finding her gone. I rarely stayed after school with friends because I always wanted to rush home and check on her. When I was about 18, she finally opened up and told me the reason behind her pain. She had been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder since childhood. From about age 5 to 16, she and her younger brother were repeatedly abused by their own father and several uncles. Her mother was an alcoholic who either turned a blind eye or simply did not care. Eventually, my mom left home, but the damage was already done. Her brother also later took his own life, long before I was born. What still confuses me is that I met my grandfather as a child and remember him seeming like a kind man. But my mom never left me alone with him, and their relationship was always tense and full of fights. I have always found it strange that she continued to meet with him at all, given what he had done. Story 27. My dad's family is a complete mess. My grandfather fathered two children with two different maids, firing both women when they needed time off because of their pregnancies. He barely gave them any money to raise his children. On top of that, he had one of his daughters thrown off the property multiple times by his guards, even beating her himself. I witnessed one of these moments on Christmas when a woman showed up, caused a scene, and was quickly dragged out. At the time, I thought she was just a random stranger, but later I learned she was my aunt. These women grew up in extreme poverty while my grandfather was a legitimate millionaire. It's rumored that one of the mothers died and that one of the daughters, the same woman who had shown up on Christmas, was forced into prostitution to survive. She also struggled with addiction. Another daughter, however, managed to escape poverty. She was intelligent, worked hard, and eventually studied in the United States, where she built a family. She had no siblings on her mother's side and tried to connect with my dad and his brothers, but they rejected her and did everything they could to keep this embarrassment hidden. She once added me on Facebook and would send me occasional birthday messages. We even lived in the same city, but I never visited her and did not know she was my aunt until years later. I have personally seen my grandfather act inappropriately around the maids, flirting with them, leering, walking around nearly naked, and touching them in ways that made me uncomfortable. After realizing what kind of man he is and how he treated people, I no longer stay with him and carry a deep resentment toward him. Story 28. Mine is not the darkest family secret, but it feels like it haunts us in the background all the time. Huntington's disease runs in our family. Out of 7 brothers, 3 developed it, most likely inheriting it from their mother, though she was never tested. With Huntington's, if even one parent has it, there is a 50% chance their children will too. The disease is cruel. It looks a lot like Parkinson's. It starts slowly, with problems standing or speaking clearly, as if drunk, and then progresses until there is no quality of life left. There is no medication, no cure. Once the signs begin, it is only a matter of decline. I knew one of the brothers who had it. He lived a normal life until around 50, but after that, everything got progressively worse. He never had children, deliberately avoiding the risk of passing it on. Another brother who developed it also never had kids. He fell into the depression often associated with Huntington's and took his own life before starting a family. The oldest brother, however, did have children, and now they also have children. I am the grandchild of one of the lucky brothers who never developed it. There is a genetic test available, but none of the at-risk relatives will say whether they have taken it. They are in their 40s and 50s now, so if either of them has it, the symptoms should begin to show soon. No one dares to bring it up, so we are all silently waiting. My parents understand why someone would not want to know, but they also feel conflicted. Having children without knowing seems like a huge gamble, since it could mean giving them a devastating future. At the same time, if those children had not been born, they would not exist at all. It is impossible to decide which is worse. I am just grateful it is not a choice I had to make, because I do not think I could have lived with it. Story 29. On both sides of my family, there are troubling histories. On my father's side, he was left by his father at a young age and raised by his mother. I was also told of unhealthy and harmful situations within extended relatives, but they were rarely spoken about openly. What disturbed me most was how some family members seem willing to excuse or dismiss these things, never truly acknowledging them as wrong. On my mother's side, my grandparents were pieds noirs, French colonists born in Algeria who lived through the war for independence. One of my grandmother's brothers, not the abuser, served as a soldier during the war. We know he killed people, though no one knows how many. Apparently, he carried a knife with tally marks scratched into it. He never spoke of the war again once he returned to France. My grandfather, meanwhile, joined the OAS, the secret army organization, at age 19. This was a far-right paramilitary group that fought to keep Algeria under French control. I do not know whether he ever planted a bomb, but I was told a story of one nearly exploding in his face. He died last year, taking most of the truth with him. My grandmother rarely talks about those years. It is too painful. But as I grew older and began piecing things together, I realized what it all meant. Parts of my family history are tied to cruelty, violence, and abuse, and it is unsettling to accept that, in some ways, my relatives were the bad guys. Story 30. I did not realize until I was older how much mental illness runs in my family. One of my aunts, my dad's sister, was heavily stigmatized and eventually placed in a mental hospital. My mom, who is not blood related, was one of the only people who ever visited her. On my dad's Vietnamese side, the stigma around mental illness was strong, and that made things worse. Because of this environment, my eldest aunt developed the mindset that she absolutely needed to have a son. She even told my mom to keep having children until she had a boy, even though my mom already had me and my two sisters. When my aunt gave birth to her second daughter, she became so angry and resentful that she wanted little to do with her. That cousin, her second daughter, was mostly raised by my grandmother instead. Eventually, my aunt did have a boy, and he became the child she adored, while her daughters were left in the background. Few people outside the family know about this dynamic, but it was terrible for her daughters. There was even an incident where she chased them around the house with a knife. I do not know the full story, and I do not think she would have actually harmed them, but it showed how unstable things were in that household and how badly they were affected by her obsession with having a son. Story 31. This is not exactly a secret anymore, though that side of the family tried hard to keep it one. My cousin's husband turned out to be a pyromaniac. When he lived in a small village, that place constantly had fires. Coincidentally, his own father was a fireman who often had to deal with them. After he moved away, the fires stopped. Then he married my cousin, and their apartment building, a 9-story complex, had about 5 fires in just 1 year. My cousin believed they were cursed. 2 of those fires were major, and 6 people died. Eventually, the building installed security cameras, and he was caught in the act. He was arrested, and we only learned the truth through news articles because my cousin's family kept telling everyone he was away for work abroad. Eventually, my grandma, who has a hard time keeping secrets, admitted the truth, and now it is out in the open. The family still insists he is innocent, appealing his case over and over, which has only resulted in him receiving longer sentences. Even before all of this, I always thought there was something off about him. At one family gathering, he got drunk and acted in ways that made me uncomfortable, though no one else seemed to notice or care. Story 32. I am German, and like many Germans, I have long-dead ancestors who fought for the Axis during the Second World War. After the war, almost no one spoke about what they had done. It was as if the whole nation decided to bury the past and never mention it again. My grandmother, who was a child during the war, only remembered the nightly bombings and the fear that came with them. She never knew what her own father, my great-grandfather, had done during those years. Eventually, she did some research of her own and discovered the truth. He had been a member of the SS and stationed in Stalingrad. He was injured there and pulled from the front lines, later serving in France. He was eventually captured and kept in France as a prisoner of war for several years before being released back to Germany. He never spoke about his experiences, likely because of trauma and guilt, but he was also one of the lucky ones. Had he stayed in Stalingrad, he almost certainly would have died when the Soviets retook the city. Story 33. This one is about my best friend. When she was a baby, her birth mother left her with a neighbor who could not have children of their own, saying it would only be for a few weeks while she sorted things out. Weeks turned into months and then years. Her birth mother never came back, and my friend was raised as the neighbor's child. She did not even have a birth certificate until she was around 3 years old. Fast forward to her 20s when she and I became close. One night, just for fun, we visited a fortune teller. The woman told her she saw uncertainty in her life and called her an infinite child. That sparked something. She confronted her parents, who finally admitted the truth. They had no real details of her birth, only the name of her biological mother. Through Facebook, my friend tracked her down and was shocked to learn that her biological mother lived just 10 minutes away. When confronted, the woman, now a respected school principal and well-regarded in her church, coldly admitted that yes, she had given birth to my friend but claimed, "You are not my child." When pressed about her father, she revealed that he had been a pastor, a congregation leader with a spotless public reputation. The pastor insisted the baby would ruin everything for him and urged her to get rid of it. Unable to go through with an abortion while still in college, she carried the pregnancy in secret and gave the baby away. For a time, my friend considered extorting the pastor for money but decided it was not worth the poison of maintaining contact. She did reach out to one of his daughters, who was not even surprised. Apparently, my friend was not his only hidden child. On the surface, she is doing well now. But once, after a night of heavy drinking, she broke down in tears, grieving everything she had learned and the weight of being discarded so carelessly. It has been less than 2 years since she uncovered the truth, and she is still processing it all. What shocks me most is how people like her parents could live their lives without remorse. Her biological mother with her career and church reputation, and her father still giving sermons while hiding behind his mask of morality. Story 34. I still cannot get much information about this even as an adult. And aside from this odd piece of family history, I have a great relationship with my relatives. My great-grandmother passed away in the late 2000s. She was from South Boston, well-connected, lived to be 101, and was still sharp and active until her death. My grandmother had grown up right next to the Bulger family, and Whitey Bulger's brother Will has remained a close family friend. Around the time of her funeral, The Departed had just come out, and I had been reading a lot about Whitey. He was still on the FBI's most wanted list and actively on the run. That's why it floored me when I saw him at my great-grandmother's funeral, clear as day, standing in the back. He was not even trying to hide. It felt like he wanted us to know he was there. I was terrified and kept quiet, not saying anything to my parents. As the service ended, he walked straight up to my mom, shook her hand, addressed her by name, and gave his condolences. I stood there stunned, watching my mom shake hands with a man who was one of America's most infamous fugitives and a mass murderer at the time. I know Whitey was a big figure in Southie, and many locals actually admired what he did for the community. But seeing him at a family funeral while he was on the run from the FBI is something I will never forget. Story 35. My grandfather was abusive, and my dad, the youngest boy, received the worst of it growing up after the Great Depression. Later, Dad joined the Army, and his experiences in Korea only added to the trauma. After he was discharged, he married his first wife out west, and they had a daughter. That marriage ended when she cheated on him with an abusive drunk. Dad left, they divorced, and she married the drunk, who went on to abuse their daughter for years, something my dad never knew about. He should have fought for custody, but he didn't. Back in his hometown, Dad married again. He and his wife worked at a bar owned by a violent man who was also a gun runner. The owner would beat up anyone who crossed him, and one night he tried to force Dad's wife into prostitution, telling Dad he could leave but she was staying. Dad tried to fight back, but the owner beat him badly. He made it home, grabbed his rifle, and returned to the bar. When the owner came out to attack him again, Dad shot and killed him. He was tried, convicted, and spent 17 years in prison. While inside, he earned his GED, some college credits, and taught other inmates to read. He eventually earned early release for good behavior and joined probation and work release. It was during this time that he met my mom, who was working in a nearby city. They fell in love but waited until his release to marry. They started a life together, moved back to his hometown, and had me later in life. Most of my peers never knew the story. Only a few of their grandparents did. So I was spared much of the stigma. Dad had demons, and he was an alcoholic through much of my childhood, though he never beat me or my siblings, keeping his vow to end the cycle of abuse. He did lash out at my mom a few times when drunk, but that stopped completely when he quit alcohol cold turkey in my teens. My parents have now been married 43 years. For all he went through and all he carried, he turned into a good father, and the cycle of abuse truly stopped with him. Story 36. I carry a tragic family legacy. It is not just skeletons in the closet. It feels more like a haunted graveyard. When my mother was 5 years old, her father put her and her 8-year-old brother in a bathtub full of water and prepared to kill them with a toaster. They survived only because someone intervened in time. After that, he spent the rest of his life in mental health institutions. On top of that, every single woman on my mother's side of the family had been subjected to abuse across multiple generations. I did not learn about any of this until I was 31. My grandfather was not born a monster. He was 19 when he fought in the Second World War, serving as a combat rifleman in the 95th Infantry under General Patton. He fought on the front lines in France and Germany, between 1944 and 1945. He did things that were considered heroic, like helping liberate a concentration camp and participating in the battle for the French city of Metz, a fortress city that had not been conquered in over 1,000 years, not since Attila the Hun. Metz was incredibly fortified, with moats, castles, thick bunkers, and German soldiers ordered to fight to the death. The weather prevented air support, tanks could not cross the moats, and bunker-busting weapons did not exist yet. That meant soldiers like my grandfather had to storm the defenses directly and fight hand-to-hand in dark, narrow tunnels. The 95th also discovered mass graves, including one where 57 Russian children and their parents had been forced to dig their own burial site before being shot. There are photographs of the children, still in their tiny coats and shoes, lying with bullet wounds in their chests. My grandfather survived by becoming a ruthless, efficient killer. He hunted Nazis like vermin. His psychotic break years later was not random. It was his mind dragging him back into that war. I know from personal experience how real those breaks can feel. Once, after eating an overly strong edible, I ended up in the emergency room convinced I was trapped in another reality. Nothing could shake me out of it. So I can imagine how, in his mind, the bathtub incident felt like another battlefield moment. Back then, no one knew how to treat combat trauma, and the medications we have today did not exist. He lived with that torment and shame until he died of a blood clot at 51, more than a decade before I was born. For most of my life, my mother refused to speak of him. He was the great family secret. Learning the truth reshaped how I saw myself, my ancestry, and my mother. I began healing through somatic therapy by talking to him in guided sessions. These encounters feel real, and I think of him now as a kind of guardian spirit. I ask him to help me know what is worth fearing and what is not. And through that, my lifelong anxiety has diminished by 90%. He taught me that fear itself is not weakness. It is a survival tool. It sharpens the senses, prepares the body, and fuels courage. Every soldier feels it. The difference is what they do with it. I love him deeply, even though we never met. I believe I inherited his instincts. The first time I picked up a gun at 32, I was a natural, as though his muscle memory had passed down to me. By making peace with him, I have begun healing our entire family line. It has also allowed me to forgive and love my mother more fully, understanding why she sometimes became violent when I was growing up. Her father was forged in violence, and she was raised in its shadow. As the Buddha teaches, to understand is to forgive. Story 37. My family comes from a remote fishing and farming village on the west coast of Ireland. My grandmother grew up on an isolated island with 15 siblings, reachable only by boat. At 17, she married my grandfather and moved to the mainland. By 2016, my grandmother was suffering from dementia. Sometimes she would cry hysterically about the baby they stole from me, though she could never explain it clearly. My aunts began to dig into it, wondering if they had an unknown older sibling out there. In our family, secret children and hidden paternity are not unheard of, but my mom strongly opposed the search. She told my aunt that it would be cruel to track this person down when my grandmother's dementia was so advanced, answers would be impossible to get. On the way home, I pressed my mom about why she was so against it. Normally, she is a huge family person and always supportive of finding lost connections. That is when she finally told me the truth. If there really was a child, it would have been born before my grandmother was married. Given her extremely isolated upbringing, that meant the child was likely the result of incest, possibly assault. My mom also revealed things about her own childhood. As the oldest girl of 11 kids, she remembered how her father, my grandfather, never allowed them to be around some of her mother's oldest brothers. Visits to her mother's side of the family were rare, except with the younger siblings. My grandfather was adamant that none of his children were ever to be left alone with those uncles, though he never explained why. Hearing that in connection with my grandmother's breakdowns about the baby makes it all too clear what may have really happened.